quite surprised that the opposition parties were prepared to give up the speaker so early.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because there was a focus on the deputy presidency.
Because once you give him the power, then he has the power.
Then he has the power. You know, state-owned entities is so important in South Africa's economy. I mean, and their failure has actually dragged down the economy. Why do the Chinese getting it right in their state-owned companies? I mean, if you don't perform, you will be jailed. A split in the ANC, and then they don't merge, but they form almost a permanent coalition.
Professor Gumede, one of South Africa's foremost thought leaders, thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
Oh, thank you. I'm very excited to be with you, and I'm very grateful that you invited me. And I'm an admirer of the work, of your work, and also, I mean, the exciting stuff, the phenomenal work that you've done on this podcast, and really is a privilege to be with you. Yeah,
appreciate it. Well, I've read your work for a long time, and obviously you've been in the public domain for many years, but maybe most recently noted for your work in the multi-party charter process, bringing opposition parties together around this pre-election agreement. And I wonder, you know, how you reflect on that process and tell us some of the stories about being invited as this independent chair to try and create for the first time an opposition pre-election agreement.
Yeah, yes, no, absolutely. I mean, my view, even prior to the multi-party charter process, was that our political parties are not fit for purpose for the present and for our current complex problems. Many of our political parties were formed during the apartheid era, so either based on liberation politics or based on the apartheid politics, you know, whether it's, you know, the old white parties. And then some of the parties that were formed in the post-1994 era were breakaways from either the liberation movement or from the older, let's call it old former white political parties.
Sure.
And I think, and that has been a problem for the country that we want to build for now and for the future. So I do think that we have to our country needs a realignment of the politics, and if you just look at the figures, I mean, our last election of the 29 May general election, we had 9 million people who registered but who didn't vote, and another 14 million people who didn't even register. So that says clearly is a sign that yes, we've got many political parties, but our political parties are not for purpose. That is why people have just given up on whether it is, you know, the ANC or on many opposition parties. So only a small group of citizens actually participates in our political processes. And unless we energize the majority of people that's outside the electoral process, I mean, people have given up hope in our electoral process and hope in our current political parties, and perhaps even hope in government, if we can energize them, bring their agency back on the one hand, but secondly, in order to partially to do that, we may also have to realign our politics and our political parties and make them fit for purpose to deal with our current problems.
And how easy or difficult was it to try and convince those parties at a time when there were many differences between them to coalesce? And to what extent do you see it as a success or a failure?
Yeah. So, you know, for a couple of years, I have lobbied many of our opposition parties to form, you know, to merge because many of our political parties are actually the same.
Sure.
I mean, the only difference is the leaders. I mean, even the slogans of many of our parties are the same. The songs are the same, and so on. So how do we consolidate the opposition parties? I mean, it was a very big thing for me. Yeah. And when I was approached early last year, I actually grasped this opportunity. When I was approached by a group of opposition parties collectively, they came to me, I mean, 11 political parties came to me and said, look, we actually want to fight the election as a coalition or at least a partnership and so on. But we need an independent person from our side to chair it and to help us make it possible. Yeah. I mean, I thought it was an exciting moment that one could begin to look at how does one realign the country's politics. I mean, now last year and even up to now, what we have, our politics has been, there's a number of anti-constitutional parties, and then there's sort of constitutional parties. And then what we also have is there are parties very rigidly ideological, either on the left or ideological on the right. And I think the best sort of position for our country, what we need almost a centrist positioning in South Africa's politics. And what do I mean by a centre? It could be a centre left, it could be a centre right, but a centre. So a centre would be pro-democracy, pro-constitution, a sort of social market acceptance, the acceptance of racial inclusivity, of non-racialism, and then a set of moral values, the acceptance of the certain ways we have to behave with decency and with honesty. And that's what I would call a centrist. Can we get that sort of platform in charge of South Africa? And I mean, that really was what drove me. But coming back to the MPC process, I mean, the end, what then happened was that, ahead of the elections in May, we had about 11 parties that agreed on common economic policies, principles of government, how they're going to deal with conflicts, and non-racialism, and the constitution as key. That pillars is going to hold them together. Then we had another group, sort of MPC Plus, who were not part of the core group, but who one could say subscribed to the MPC's agreement, but who would, if the MPC if the individual members would have won the election, would have then joined the government, and they would have put the government together. So like a core MPC with its 11 members, and then sort of outsider parties who were open to form a government if that was possible.
And what were the kind of, to the extent obviously that you're able to share, because I know that confidentiality is obviously key to these kinds of agreements, but what were the kinds of challenges on the inner workings of the MPC that you can share that maybe will shed light and help us learn as a country about the difficulties of making parties work together? Because it's clear that's going to be part of our political future going forward.
I mean, the first of the challenge really is leadership ego. Now, in countries with complex problems like South Africa's problems, we need a higher maturity of political leadership. And up to now, we haven't had that. And that's our challenge. So we, as a country, we are not going to be able to deal with our complex issues with unemployment, with poverty, with our inequalities, and to industrialize and getting a stable society, peaceful society, unless we have a higher quality of leadership. So, where people look beyond the ego. And so when I say maturity, I'm going to define what I think what maturity is. I mean, the first thing is to be able to make policies that is not related to your ego. And secondly, to make policies which is not ideologically rigid, to be pragmatic and to be practical and to be inclusive. And maybe thirdly, to look at the interests of the country first. Now, often people and political parties confuse their own interests as the country's interests or as the nation's interests. And the same with, it's not only governing parties, but often opposition parties also. They think, well, these are our policies, these are our interests. This is actually the interest of the country. This is actually the national interest. Now, that's not the case. Now, mature political leaders look at a country or look at policy or decisions through the lens of what is in the national interest, what is in the country interest. So once a leader begins to think that way, you immediately actually may come up with decisions that is not necessarily the same as your party policies and ideologies, but you may come up with different policies and so on. And that's what maturity means, because, so there may be the country's interests might be different to your party's interests or your own personal self interest. And that really is a maturity. And we haven't had that kind of leadership. And maybe the last part where people often don't take seriously decency. Can we have leaders that are decent? And leaders that are pragmatic and values driven. And then also, and that would mean leaders that are self-aware. Self-aware, they're confident within themselves. They're confident within self. Because if you're not confident within yourself, you're going to be violent. You're going to fall into victimhood. You're going to blame others. And so on. You're not going to take responsibility for your own mistakes or when you're wrong, because you're not confident enough within yourself.
To what extent do you think the MPC process has actually prefigured the GNU? Because in some ways, and former President Zuma himself, maybe in jest or in attack, but interestingly said, the GNU is the MPC plus the ANC, which in some ways shows that the groundwork done on that must have played a role in the eventual coalition, even if it was a different configuration of parties in the end. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely. I think, the MPC experience actually laid the groundwork for the current government of national unity, and also for the groundwork of cooperative coalitions. Of working together, and even if you disagree on ideology and policies, because that's an important political cultural change that as a country we have to get into. That yes, you may agree on, or political parties may disagree on some policies, or even on ideology and so on. There are bigger country interests which are more important than those type of disagreements. And I think that what it is at two levels. One is just on a political party level, the idea that we have to work together, which wasn't there before. So once we got that agreement for the first time in South Africa's modern history, the first pre-electoral coalition, that I think was a game shifter. It was a game shifter because a new culture, I think, sprung up there, that really it is important to collaborate, to partner in our diverse society. That's very important. But the second one is also, it made even the negotiations easier for the government of national unity. Made it so much easier, because what you now had, when the ANC began to negotiate to put together a government of national unity, we had 15 parties linked to the MPC that had already had negotiations and agreements. So the MPC plus the MPC plus that already had that, and so on. And also, from the ANC side, there were already informal discussions and so on. So the groundwork had been laid.
Okay. So there were even some ANC MPC chats informally.
Informal, because when you do these negotiations, in a sense, you have to plan for the future.
Yeah, of course.
And even in the MPC process, they were planning of, all the scenarios. Okay. First scenario, as a group, they win. Yeah. The elections, they put their own government together, like the best case scenario. Second best case scenario, they don't have enough votes, but they can bring other parties into government and put together a coalition with MPC plus coalition. And then the third scenario is the ANC actually loses, but has a majority, and then will now call in, can actually dictate the terms for a coalition. So those are three scenarios. So, we engaged those scenarios beforehand. So even the MPC members were very much prepared. obviously, even myself, I did not even think that we would get to the government of national unity, although we discussed and planned for something like that.
Interesting.
But it wasn't in my. I honestly was surprised that we got to that. I mean, the mandate of the MPC was to take the ANC below 50%, and then to try to form a government. But then, I mean, ANC dropped below 40% to 39%. I mean, that changed the reality. That changed the game. And almost it meant there had to be a renegotiation of the MPC. I'll just give you an example. I mean, after the election results came out, and it was clear that the ANC dropped below 40%, the MPC had to meet as a group to decide what now. Because before, I mean, a key part of the MPC agreement was that the parties would not govern with the ANC. I mean, that was a key part, and so on. And the MPC agreement lasted all the way until the 2029 elections, and that they would, and also that they would run the next local government election together. So that almost, that the 2024 general election was like the beginning. They're not victorious. The 2029 would be the end game, really. I mean that was the idea, and then that they would learn out of the 2024 election campaign to run a local government campaign better prepared. So, well, I mean that was the idea. Now, and that scenario was based on the fact that the ANC would, if the ANC gets either above 50% or just below 50%, but not where the ANC got 40% and below. I mean, for the ANC to get 39%, it was a game changer. Absolutely. Now, in any other kind of society, the opposition parties would then put together a government. I mean, that's the extraordinary in our country. So, the MPC sort of been able to put a government together with the MPC plus. But the difficulty is, and in our politics, and there's also the difficulties that the ANC struggled with is, parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters and Quantum Sizwe of Jacob Zuma, I mean, those parties were perceived not to be reliable or, and so on, from what they want to extract from a policy a point of view, and reliability, and maybe that's not necessarily a big problem, but would be reliability in terms of, can you agree on a contract with them? Are they reliable enough and responsible enough to sign up for a 5-year coalition agreement and stay consistent and wouldn't walk out over differences and so on, and that has been the challenge. And it's an important point to make, because in a post-Second World War period, in many of the successful national coalitions in other countries that produce economic growth and economic miracles, let's just say, in the Western world, in Germany, for example, just one example. There's often been national coalitions across the ideological divide. So coalitions are not successful because they're just from one ideology, or successful economic growth has come from diverse coalitions, national coalitions in other countries. I mean, in the developing country, Brazil, I mean, they've been having coalitions of 9 to 10 to 12 parties across the ideological spectrum. I mean, the current coalitions led by Lula da Silva's Workers' Party. I mean, the Workers' Party actually is almost a bit of although it's a dominant, it doesn't have a big minority. There are 9 to 10 parties in that coalition that stretch from the left to Catholic parties, to the extreme, not progressive Catholic parties, but very conservative Catholic parties. So that's what their coalition has been all about. And then in other places, like, for example, in Israel, I mean, the Bennett government during COVID, under his prime minister, has ideologically cross-ideological coalition that included an Arab party and 2 Zionist parties, and the left.
That takes political differences to a new level.
To a new level, So the issue is, the success of a coalition, whether it's at a local level or at a national level, is not about ideological convergence. You could be different ideologically.
Absolutely.
So that's not the issue, but it's in a maturity.
Sure.
If the when the idea is such a, the ideologies are so different, and the policy outlooks are so different, and parties' histories are so different, and parties clashed in the past, then maturity of political leadership becomes important. And secondly, and linked to that maturity, the country's interest becomes then important. Can parties look at a country's interest first? And can they understand, can leaders and party supporters also understand that their interest, their individual interest, or their party's interest is not a national interest? And then sometimes you have to cede your personal interest and your party interest and ideological interest in order to bring success to the country and in order to deal with the country's poverty and inequality, and to stabilize the country. You might have to cede your own and get rid or compromise on your own ideology for the greater good, to make the country work and make the country good.
Sam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. One of the interesting outcomes of the election for me, and we shared a stage recently, is just how much the ANC has been able to actually retain in this government of national unity. And as you say, one outcome would be that the ANC was completely ejected from power. It seems curious to me that the ANC has managed to hold on to so much, from the presidency, deputy presidency, the Speaker of Parliament, much of Gauteng. And I wonder what you make of that, because in some ways I think it is a missed opportunity for our country to experiment with other forms of leadership, even if it's a party that, one doesn't like, just to see how a different party actually holds power.
Yeah, in one way, it's a missed opportunity. Obviously, in another way, the government of national unity is almost the best outcome that we could have got for the circumstances, but it's still a missed opportunity.
Sure.
It's a missed opportunity in terms of, although the ANC got 39% of the vote, it dominates cabinet.
Yeah.
And the ANC also hasn't used, if the ANC had used the opportunity to bring in fresh blood and new ideas among its own ranks, that would have made a difference. The beauty of democracy is that if a governing party doesn't deliver, it brings in a new party with new people, new ideas, new energy, and so on. Now, the problem is the ANC has been in power for 30 years, so the same people has been running ministers, debating ideas, dominating the public sphere. And that has deprived society of that dividend of democracy. The dividend of democracy is a change.
Absolutely.
When a party doesn't deliver. So we haven't had that dividend. And that is a problem that we've seen in the last, actually, over 177 years since Liberia became the first African country to be independent. It's been a very long time of independence now in Africa. Is that parties and leaders stay so long that the societies don't get the dividend of democracy. And the dividend of democracy is absolutely powerful if it works. If a party doesn't deliver, and then other parties come into power to bring in the new ideas, fresh blood, new ways of looking, energy also, because a lot of, if you stay too long, you're so complacent, you're jaded, you do the same things over and over again, and also the accountability. A key thing about democracy is accountability, and the only real accountability essentially in a democracy is if a party gets ejected. If a party doesn't get ejected, there's no incentive for their party to be accountable. They can make all the promises in the world, but there's no incentive because they know people are going to vote for them again. And we've missed out, sadly, as a country. And that is one of the reasons why we've we had state failure, high levels of corruption, incompetence, and so on. It's because of that. And the ANC, and coming back to the ANC, I mean, there was a space for them now to bring in a whole new generation of leaders among themselves, different people who've never been in government. So they haven't done that, because what they've done is they try to balance all of the interests of the party, and they reappointed many people to satisfy all the factions and all the groups in a party, which meant bringing the same people that have been there before. So I mean, any reasonable person will ask, like, what is a person that's been a cabinet minister maybe for 30 years?
Yeah, exactly.
And so on, and who have failed. What's that person going to change there? And the same with policies. And I know people say, well, if the policies are good, it's just an implementation issue. Now, some policies clearly, I mean, if you have policies for 30 years and it hasn't delivered on growth, and so on, you have to re-look at it.
Absolutely.
You cannot say, well, we're just going to re-implement. I mean, it's illogical, and so on. And actually, I think the interesting thing that we may see is that the non-ANC ministers may actually deliver more, because they'll be more energized. They knew they want to deliver. They want to show they can do it. And so on, versus the ANC ministers has been there before. They've done, they kind of go back and repeat the same policies, the same ways of doing. So we're almost going to have a two-stream cabinet here. One where I think non-ANC ministers are going to likely to perform better, because they will feel the pressure more than the ANC, with ministers who've been there before, felt the pressure. Although I think actually, I mean, there's obviously a different scenario. If the non-ANC ministers perform, they will put pressure on the ANC ministers to lift their game. So it'll be, at the end, I think our GNU will deliver much better than, sort of the dominant ANC in the past, because of this new accountability that we're getting.
I heard you mentioning at this event we were at that you were an advisor to President Ramaphosa in his academic life. Is that true? Are we not allowed to talk about that? We can cut it out.
Can we cut it? Can we cut it?
Okay. That's for the members. President Ramaphosa leads the country. He's in an interesting position as well, because on the one hand, he's lost, unprecedented support. It's hard to see how this is anything other than an electoral failure for the ANC. But at the same time, both his party and opposition parties see him as the logical leader of the government. And that's a funny and a paradoxical position in which to be. On the one hand, you've lost support, but on the other hand, even your enemies are invested in your leadership. What do you make of his position right now, and what would success look like, and what would failure look like for him as a political leader?
Yeah. I mean, that's the irony, that taking the ANC to a 39% defeat, and having to put together a government of national unity, bringing in the opposition, that he is still in the seat. Yeah. Now, in any other party, it would have kicked him out. Yeah. Now, there would have been a massive fight in the party, and then people would have called for leadership change. But I mean, he brings something in this moment, and I think his strength is, this type of negotiations. And when you were asking, why is the ANC dominating the GNU? I mean, that really is a lot to say about his adeptness in the negotiation, because where I was sitting and advising some of the opposition parties going in into the negotiations, for me was look, in a government of national unity, first you don't go into a grand coalition, you ask for a government of national unity. That's a key thing. And secondly, when you get down to the negotiations, from an opposition party point of view, is the beginning is critical, because at the beginning we've got, there was a limited period to elect a president. Now that's where the power of the opposition lies, like that part of the negotiations. So you know, the ANC wanted to re-elect the president, and that is where the opposition sort of then push their demands. And my advice was that, look, if there's agreement, there's a presidency goes to Ramaphosa, the speaker must go to the opposition. I mean, at all costs. So, you know, that's quite important. In our system, in our political system, we've got a chief justice, the president as a speaker. I mean, there's the three pillars of our political system. So, you know, government of national unity, or even any other national coalition, if the one party gets the president, the other party has to get the speaker.
I was quite surprised that the opposition parties were prepared to give up the speaker so early.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because there was a focus on the deputy presidency job, because in our political system, the deputy presidency is generally the leader of government business. But unfortunately, that's not an entrance. It is the behest of the president. If we, for example, the deputy presidency was like a prime minister type of position, which is entrenched in a constitutional system, that would be different, because then in a coalition, the opposition parties would have asked for the prime ministership in that sort of thing. So, but coming back on the negotiations part of it, again, so if I would have demanded, and my advice was, you know, if the ANC gets the presidency and even the speaker, then the opposition parties must get an oversized number of cabinet positions. You know, that sort of thing. Say, for example, I mean, you know, because the president and the speaker weighed so much, so if you're a opposition negotiator and you don't get that, you have to get at least a treasury. And so on, and some of the big portfolios. And I guess that is where Ramaphosa's his negotiation skills, certainly, because the opposition sort of put it all on paper before they voted for the president.
Because once you give him the power, then he has the power. Right?
Then he has the power. Unfortunately, I think, and that really is, because at the end of the day, as advice you outside, is the negotiators of the parties go and negotiate. I mean, they can come back and bounce off ideas and ask for, but you know, at the end of the day, and so on. So I think it's a big part of the, you know, that of Ramaphosa. I mean, and it also, as I say, fits his profile, and maybe there's also his weakness as a president. He's been his weakness, because as a president, you have to be, in our country, much more. You have to be decisive. Yes, you can negotiate, but then you have to be decisive. You can't compromise forever and ever. And that's been, you know, one of the reasons why his presidency, why he struggled and his presidency. But it's just sort of moments when you're behind the scenes, and when you talk publicly, you know, when you explain it, that's sort of, you know, that's his sort of thing. But executive management is his weakness. And that's really is, I think it's going to be for him a challenge in a government of national unity. I mean, he struggled with executive management when he was in full control. Absolutely. When all of the cabinets were ANC members. Now, cabinet ministers are not ANC members. They've got their own party mandate also. They're not going to follow the line from the president. So they're going to be more robust. So up to now, although I don't think Ramaphosa up to now would have had such fightbacks that you will get in a government of national unity, and so on. So I think this is going to be, for him, it's going to be a really big challenge. Although, even if I think a big part of just getting the GNU together is a big plus for him, and also says a lot of his capabilities as a negotiator. And we have to separate that capabilities as a negotiator from the capabilities of executive management of a government. But I must also say, you know, the ANC put a very good negotiating team together. I mean, they had, people in that team. I think, who was in that team? But it was a good.
I think you had Makura was there.
Makura was in the team. Former ANC deputy, the general secretary of the Youth League. Not Kekana, in the temple. So I think
Yes,
it was a very practical team, a very pragmatic team that played very well with or aligned very well with Ramaphosa. And then there was also other groupings. I think the Veterans League was really wisdom, and they were very wise, and I think they stepped up during the negotiations also. And so on. So, you know, they had an ecosystem of let's go to more democratic people, people more pragmatic, people more looking at the country's interests, more because there's many other ANC leaders that are not of that orientation. So that also helped during the negotiations to put a GNU together.
As far as policy is concerned, because obviously now this government has to act, and one hopes that it isn't just going to do the same things and is actually going to try and do some fresh things. One of the key headaches, of course, for the Ramaphosa administration before was state-owned enterprises and what happens over there. You've done some interesting work in advising government, but also in your academic writing around state-owned enterprises. What do you think can be done differently there to reignite the economy and turn state ownership into an asset? You know, what needs to be got rid of? Where are the new opportunities for state intervention? And how do you see that whole basket of questions?
You know, state-owned entities is so important in South Africa's economy. I mean, and their failure has actually dragged down the economy. And that's the first thing. The second thing, if you compare our country to more successful countries like Singapore and South Korea and Japan, now in these countries, the state-owned entities and the private sector companies are almost at par. I mean, we've seen it also in China.
Sure.
So some of China's successful state-owned companies, if you look at them with and if you compare them with Chinese successful private companies, they're almost, you know, they're close. But us, the state-owned companies are so bad. You know, the difference and the ineffectiveness, the corruption, you know, state-owned companies are so bad, they can't even compete. If you take a post office or post bank compared to a standard bank in the private sector, you know, the distance is just too wide. And, you know, that gap. And because of that, and because the state-owned companies is so heavily invested in our economy, we can't turn around the economy without dealing with state-owned entities. I mean, I was on about 3 inquiries related to state-owned entities. I mean, the original former President Jacob Zuma's Presidential Review Committee on State-owned companies, which I was advisor on, and I also chaired in 2017 the Department of Public Enterprises strategy. A long-term strategy for state-owned entities. So what was clear to me on both sides, I mean, very, very few of our recommendations of both these 2 forums, recommendations were actually implemented, and so on. I mean, in all of this, we predicted the Transnet crisis. I mean, it was not predicted because it was obvious. Eskom is obvious. It was obvious, and that's, I guess, a heartbreaking thing. It's obvious if you don't have competence. And maybe the third thing about state-owned entities that people often don't realize, a state-owned entity, by its nature, needs a higher level of competence than a private sector. And that's a very important thing. So if you deploy political people to a state-owned entity, it's a disaster. You actually have to have people with a higher competence than a person who will be appointed as a CEO of Standard Bank.
That's where the best leaders should be.
Absolutely. And that is, I mean, to start off, that's actually a major reason why state-owned entities in places like Singapore and South Korea and Japan have done so well, or even you know in Europe, in places like Norway, and so on, is that the people, you know, the executives and the board members there, you know, are very good. I mean, if you compare them to the private sector equivalent, they either like you know, head to head, or they're above. Because there's something about a state-owned entity as an organization, the way it works. And I've also chaired state-owned entities, and I've cleaned up on behalf of the South African government state-owned entities. So I've had real experience myself of state-owned entities. There's something about state-owned entities is a political element. So the first thing is executives. So often there is governments feel often maybe under pressure to reward people by giving them positions state-owned, but deploy what we call now deployment.
Sure.
And so on. So deployment without the right skills and so on. That's the first thing. The second thing in terms of state-owned entities almost cannot fail because the governments will bail them out, or the managers and the boards think they can't fail because they will always just get money from government. Whereas in a private company, if you fail, you're fired or the company gets closed down.
Yeah.
So that the failure, the ruthlessness of failure is actually important in a company. To make a company, and hold people accountable in a company. So that's missing in our state-owned entities. I mean, in places like China, and why do the Chinese getting it right in their state-owned companies, or rather their top-tier state-owned companies, because they do allow the lower-tier state-owned companies to be run like our failing state-owned entities, but they've got a top-tier state-owned companies where, I mean, if you don't perform, you will be jailed.
Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it.
Or you will be executed. I mean, that really is accountability.
Although South Africans may want that, but I think we can veer away from. Yeah. But sure,
So
there's consequences.
There's the consequences. That's the consequences, and so on. So that's going to be important. So how do we clean up our state-owned entities? I mean, the first thing really is to say, well, hold people accountable.
Yeah.
Really hold them accountable. Link all of their performance or the incentives to their performances very, very strictly. And that's going to be very important. I mean, during the years of Transnet failure, ESCOM failure, people would get bonuses and so on. I mean, people get bonuses just to arrive at work. Cut that out almost immediately. I would even say in our context, give a haircut of, salary haircut to all top executives right now and board members in state-owned entities. Make appointments transparent, much more transparent. For example, I mean, if there is when people apply to jobs, make public who applied and who got it, so there's a public measure to say, well, there's a competent person. Why did so and so get a job? Or was not even interviews. And then the same with procurement. I mean, in state-owned entities, really where a lot of corruption is sitting, possibly a third to half of the corruption is sitting in their procurement budgets. Make that also more transparent. And I would even make a case for bringing civil society and ordinary citizens and customers also into the governance process of state-owned entities. For example, what we need to do is the views of citizens let's call citizens the customers, their views of the performance of a state-owned entity, bring it into when we do performance management. Sure. Did a post office if you attended a post office, did you get the services, the queues, where people are polite and so on. Make that part of performance, because that's essentially what they do in Singapore, what they do in Japan, and so on. So because you're a state-owned entity, that kind of voice, bring that voice in as part of and so on, of measuring performance. And then some state-owned entities, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to turn them around. So let a private sector and civil society deliver services. In those cases. Some entities must just be closed down. I mean, some people argue wrongly that state-owned entities don't need to make a profit. State-owned entities need to make a profit. And if they don't make a profit, then they at least will have to give an argument why they don't make a profit. And that's how state-owned entities are measured in countries where they perform. Is if you can't make a profit, then make a case a good case that is reasonable and logical for why you're not making a profit, and then cut bonuses and incentives if that's not happening, and so on. So some of our state-owned entities really, we should actually just close them down.
That would also open up the space for thinking about where else the state might intervene that makes more sense now. Maybe it made sense for the state to be in certain sectors 30 years ago, but if we keep trying to resuscitate the failed entities, then we may be missing new opportunities for state intervention in new industries and new avenues.
Yeah, so theoretically, why do countries set up state-owned entities? There's a reason why countries set up state-owned entities. They set up state-owned entities if no one else can do the job in the country. If there isn't the resources or the state doesn't have the resources or the technology, only in those or in critical areas, mission critical areas, where the private sector are not going to enter because it's just too risky.
Sure.
So that's the definition of a state-owned entity. But we are in South Africa, we're setting up state-owned entities without asking why are we setting them up. If the private sector already delivers efficiently and so on, there's no need for a state-owned company in those areas. I would like a current example. I mean, a lot of people argue for a state-owned bank, but we've got many state-owned banks. I mean, there is from the Land Bank to the Development Bank of Southern Africa, to provincial state banks. Many of them fail. Why would you create another one? There had a post bank that didn't work out. So that is a case, for example, why not focus on cleaning up and getting efficiency in the institutions that are there, or cutting out those institutions and so on. Or alternatively, if we say, well, the financial sector is dominated by the private sector. If we say that, then we say, how do we get that regulation right, that they do, the private sector also deliver some public services for the poor in the banking area. So those are much more imaginative discussions, more nuanced discussions. So currently also our public discourse, sadly, in both in economics, but also in our politics, is too black and white, too based on ideology and not based on reality. So, I mean, we need to get even our public discourse on the economic side we have to raise the bar a little bit. So it's not sloganeering, or it's not based on ideology, wishful thinking, or fantasy, but based on reality and based on what has worked elsewhere.
Just finally, Prof, what are your thoughts on a deeper realignment in our politics? Because it seems, as you said, to go back to the beginning, that we have the old political vehicles trying to operate in a new political environment. And one would expect over time, next 5 or 10 years, that there'll actually be a realignment of those very vehicles. What do you make of that prospect? And how do you think we as a country should negotiate that realignment?
I think it's critical that we realign our politics. I mean, I myself personally, I've decided that I will stay engaged in that process. I mean, I've declined. I was offered now to go to Parliament. I declined. It's because, firstly, that's not my space. I am in a space of ideas, and not only ideas, but running non-state entities. That's what's important to me and civil society and academic space. That's important to me, not to be in Parliament or even to be in cabinet.
Sure.
And so on. But I think in terms of, how I would foresee a realignment of politics, what we need to do, even the ANC, so we need to have realignment even on the left also, on the ANC's left.
Sure,
when I say
absolutely.
the left, the ANC's left, there has to be a realignment, even there. So let me start there. For example, I mean, the ANC is a broad church. Now, the broad church was good during the liberation struggle. In the liberation struggle, you don't need policies. All you need to have, you unite all ideologies behind one goal, get out an oppressive government. Now, once you get to government, then you have to focus and now realign that liberation movement, broad church, into a modern governing political party. So the ANC has failed to do that.
Sure.
And so on. So in a modern political party, you have to make choices. You have to make ideological choices, and you have to be clear about our choices. But secondly, you have to become more professional and more evidence-based. Now, in a liberation struggle, you don't have to be evidence-based. You can come up with slogans and ideological-based policies. But when you're in government, there's a reality. There's some things that work and other things that don't work. And so on. So there has to be a realignment between the sort of a centrist left part of the ANC and maybe the populists and so on. So the populists have already left the ANC. So the economic freedom fighters, the populist left have left the ANC. So there's also Mkhonto where MK Party, EFF, I think. So that's already a mini realignment has happened.
But you would see possibly aspects of what are currently the tripartite alliance maybe finding some kind of consolidation there and unification or cooperation.
Absolutely. So I think there's going to be a realignment because, and I think the thing that's going to spur this realignment is actually those who are in favor of the ANC being in alliance with the DA and the IFP, with their former MPC members, and those who wanted the ANC to be in alliance with the EFF and the MK. I mean, that fight is still to come. And so on. So that fight within the ANC actually might push the ANC into a realignment. I mean, the South African Communist Party and COSATU, I mean, for example, they've rejected...
Quite strongly,
and very strongly, they've rejected the ANC's, the GNU with the DA and the IFP, and so on. But that fight is still to come.
Sure.
And that may actually, help with a realignment of our politics. I think, the ANC must, the core of the ANC must just be a social democratic party on the center left. And then, workers-based type of, further to the left, the Communist Party and parts of COSATU must just form a party to the left. And then we have the populist left. So, I would call EFF and MK, they're populist left. They're not, true left. They're on the populist side. And that may be one spectrum of our politics. And then on the opposition parties' side, most of our positions on the center right. And most of those parties should actually combine.
Yeah, absolutely.
They should combine, and then we have a much more better politics. I mean, the exciting thing is in many countries in the post-war war, that actually happened. I mean, in Italy, for example, and I really admired what happened after the Cold War in Italy. So the parties to the right, the Christian type of parties and so on, they're all consolidated over the years, and from the Cold War, and they reformed their space. But the left has also done the same. The Communist Party of Italy doesn't exist anymore. They changed their name, and they also reformed.
Right.
And they brought in civil society and the sort of intellectual lefts and so on. And that happened. So their system is actually reformed. Even in other kind of societies, in Vietnam, I mean, the debate since the late 80s and particularly now, since 2011 has been how to reform a communist party so it's more market-based, for example, more in tune to our current situation. So lots of the debates around the world. We're stuck, sadly, in South Africa. It's like we're stuck in an ideological vacuum, as if we're still in the Cold War, where the world hasn't moved on, where every other society, when I say every other, maybe not every other society, but where there's genuine attempts to sift countries and societies for the better. I mean, even the Chinese Communist Party, I mean, they went actually they copied actually the Vietnamese Communist Party's reforms. How to become more market-based, how to become more professional, how to bring in non-communists into the Communist Party, for example. I mean, I'm using these examples just to show in terms of we need to begin to look at all of our individual parties that were formed in the past. Are they relevant for our times? Do they have the right type of ideas for our times? Are they aligned to our constitution? Because we've got a constitutional democracy, and many of our parties were formed prior to the constitution, and the constitution, party constitutions and country constitution don't align. So and that will have to be part of the realignment of the process. I mean, I'm just thinking, for example, the same, let's just say in the MPC, like the DA.
Sure.
I mean,
that's the interesting one.
Is it, should they be a party as it is now, sort of stuck on a sort of 22%? Or should there be a SIF in the party? I mean, is classical liberalism, for example, does it fit in a South Africa, in a developing country, or should it be much more? Could they become a liberal social democratic party? Because there is a under Clinton, the Democratic Party wasn't a liberal social democratic party.
Sure.
So, is that the space?
I think that's a fascinating question to end off, because it seems to me that the DA faces a choice whether, on the one hand, they try to gravitate closer to the ANC, and maybe as one part of the ANC splits off, they find a new agreement together, or they see their fortunes outside the ANC and they try to consolidate with everyone who's outside. And I think that decision will be quite key to the next few years.
No, absolutely. It will be a very, very key decision. I mean, I think there are two routes for the DA is the one route is, which I've, in a long past, tried to kind of persuade some DA leaders to go to liberal social democracy, right?
Sure.
And then go for a social market like in Germany. So it's not your traditional classical free market, but a social market. So a market that look after everyone and includes social justice. So that's what I would call a social market. That is sort of in Germany and so on, and even in Scandinavian countries, where
Absolutely.
no matter if it's a conservative party or the left in power, there'll be a social justice component.
There will be a serious offer.
And so on. Yeah. So that's the one way. The second way would be for them is a split in the ANC, and then they don't merge, but they form almost a permanent coalition. I mean, in Europe, there are many of these type of coalitions that last, for decades. Governing coalitions. Parties are different, but they're in a coalition, and they go, into elections in a coalition. So you're getting together, but you don't merge.
Yeah.
But in a kind of long-term coalition, governing coalition. But there's also some exciting things for the Inkatha Freedom Party, for example. I mean, where they started off, can they successfully turn themselves into a modern conservative party for Black South Africans, still aligned with the Constitution, because we've got a Constitution. And so on. I mean, even for parties like the ACDP, African Christian Democratic Party. I mean, I'm surprised in our country, which is it's a Christian religious. I mean, there's a majority. There's potential there to create, a Christian-based party linked to a Christian-based social movement, and so on. Those are the possibilities, and I think these are some of the conversations the parties must have, and society must have also, because it's not just a political party conversation. This is a society conversation. It's a civil society conversation. It's a media conversation. It's a conversation by young people.
Well, Prof Gumede, thank you so much. We could go on for hours and hours, and maybe hopefully one day we'll have you back. But we really appreciate you sharing your insights with us and the SMWX community.
No, thank you for having me, and God bless.
Aye.
Na